So one of the great things about archaeology is that as archaeologists, we dig up not just palaces and temples and big buildings, but we dig up the remains associated with everybody else in the population.
Dynamic biblical discussions with special guests exploring tough biblical issues, academic scholarship, ethics, archaeology, textual criticism, Old Testament, New Testament, Bible interpretation, apocalyptic literature, Christian history, ancient Near East cultures. You're tuned in to Conversations with Pastor Cliff on Puluso Ministries.
Good day, everybody. Welcome back to another episode on Puluso Ministries on Conversations with Pastor Cliff. And today we have a wonderful guest, and her name is Jodi Magness. She's a professor in archaeology at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. And she's going to be telling us a lot more about archaeology. And our title for today is The Jesus of Archaeology. So that should be quite interesting for a lot of you back home that are tuning in. And welcome, Jodi, to Puluso Ministries on Conversations with Pastor Cliff.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Great, thank you. I know you have written a number of books in your work. I mean, one of your current books is the book on Masada, the revolt to the modern myth, which was published in 2019, and the Archaeology of Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which was the second edition published in this year, actually 2021. And you have other books like Stone and Dung, Oil and Split, and The Jewish Daily Life in the Time of Jesus. So that's quite interesting for us to pick from some of the work that you have done in the past. So yeah, before we actually get into our conversation today, I would just like you to give a brief sort of summary of who you are, a bit of background as to, what has led you to be interested in archaeology, because not a lot of people go into archaeology.
That's true.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, I'll try and be brief. Anybody who's interested, though, in more of my biography or in the books or anything else, I do have a website, and it's just my name, all one word, jodimagness.org. I don't know, maybe you'll post that with your link. So that's an easy way to get the information. So yeah, okay. So very brief life history. I wanted to be an archaeologist since I was 12 years old. When I was 12, I had a really good history teacher, and I fell in love with ancient Greece. And my interest ever since then was focused on the classical world. And I ended up, for a number of reasons, in Israel. I finished high school there. I ended up doing my undergraduate degree there. And so I eventually came to specialize in the archaeology of Israel or Palestine, whatever you want to call it, in the classical periods, pretty much in the Roman periods and going into the early Islamic period. And so that's been the focus of my research. I do teach in a department of religious studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. My position is actually in early Judaism, not in archaeology, which means Judaism in the time of Jesus. And the reason for that is because my research focuses on the time of Jesus in Israel. And as you pointed out, I've done work on the site of Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, and other sites that relate to the time of Jesus. I'm actually in the process now of writing a book about Jerusalem. So
fantastic.
Yeah, that's a challenge. There's a lot involved in that. So that's what that's sort of my trajectory. I have conducted a number of excavations in Israel, and my current excavation is at an amazing site in Galilee, very close to the Sea of Galilee, called Huqoq, which is spelled Huqoq, and there's actually a link on my personal website to the DIG website if anybody's interested, which is an ancient Jewish village in Galilee, and we are bringing to light the remains of a monumental synagogue building that dates to a little bit after the year 400 AD, that is decorated with spectacular mosaic floors depicting a whole variety of biblical scenes, including Noah and the flood, the parting of the Red Sea, Samson, Jonah, the Tower of Babel. I mean, we've got it all. So people may be interested. You can find articles and coverage and images of the mosaics on our DIG website if they're interested.
Fantastic. Thanks for that background, Jodi. And I know archaeology is something that is very helpful but a lot of people tend to confuse it with historian. So they would tend to think an archaeologist is a historian. Would you perhaps flesh out a bit of a difference? What is the difference between the two, historian and archaeologist?
I am so glad you asked that, because I think it depends on how you define history and archaeology. So it's very, I'm laughing because when I interviewed for my current position at UNC Chapel Hill, which was, I did the interview back in 2002, but again, the department is not a department of archaeologists. It's, it's a religious studies department. And at the time, one of my more senior colleagues, who actually is a good friend, in the interview kept saying, well, but insisting, but you're an historian. And I kept saying, no, I'm an archaeologist. And he kept saying, no, you're an historian. And I was like, no, I'm an archaeologist. So it kind of, it's actually taken me a while to understand where he was coming from. So history, broadly speaking, of course, is the study of the human past, right?
Yeah.
So archaeologists do, in fact, study the human past. So in the very broad sense of the word, archaeologists are historians because we're interested in studying the human past. However, archaeologists and historians from the archaeological point of view use different types of information to learn about the past. So from my point of view as an archaeologist, an historian is somebody who studies the past based on written sources, things that people wrote and left behind, right? Yeah. Whereas archaeologists study the past based on human material culture, meaning anything that people manufactured and left behind. So pottery, buildings, coins, whatever people manufactured. And that means, by the way, that archaeologists don't study dinosaurs. We don't actually even study, technically we don't specialize in things like bones or floral and faunal remains. Those types of things, which do get dug up by archaeologists, are studied by specialists in those fields who technically are not archaeologists. So for example, my staff for my dig includes somebody who specializes in animal bones, right? They're an archaeozoologist or a zooarchaeologist, right? They do animal bones. I have a floral specialist, somebody who's paleobotanist who does ancient plants, right? So they're part of my dig team because we dig up that stuff and we dig up everything else. But archaeology is the study of the past based on human material culture, right? Yeah.
Okay, that's fantastic. And tell me what sort of limitations would an archaeologist encounter, vis-a-vis science historian and from the field of archaeology itself? What are some of the challenges that you find that limit you in terms of your work?
Exactly, and really these are such great questions because people often expect archaeology to provide kinds of information that archaeology is not equipped to provide. And so first of all, let me distinguish between what we learn from historical sources versus archaeological information, right? So historical sources, this is literature, people wrote things down. And so they wrote things that often express their point of view, their perspective, what they were thinking, right? And so that's one of the great things about historical sources, that that a lot of this information got written down and we get to hear from the people themselves in their own words. One of the problems is most of the time, even today, there's nothing that's completely objective anyway. But there's no such thing really in the past, in the ancient world, as an objective history per se, and certainly not in the modern sense of the word. And of course, it's important to remember that the people who tended to write the documents that we read as historical sources in the ancient world were male and elite. Right. And so we hear from a very particular and rather narrow perspective about the ancient world from those sources. We don't tend to hear about women, children, marginalized populations. And by the way, the majority of the population that was not elite, right? Yeah. So that's one of the limitations of historical sources. And even when they may mention or refer to or even write about those other kinds of populations, again, we're hearing it from their perspective, right? Okay. So one of the great things about archaeology is that as archaeologists, we dig up not just palaces and temples and elite buildings, but we dig up the remains associated with everybody else in the population. So archaeology does complement and expand our picture of the past because of the type of remains that we dig up. But archaeology will not give us the kind of information that somebody writing firsthand will give us. So for, what they were thinking, right? So as an archaeologist, we may be able to excavate a building and maybe roughly date the construction of that building and maybe identify what it was used for. But we're not going to get really fine-grained information about exactly what was exactly what was done on any given day in any given room in that building, and who exactly was in that building at any given time. And that sort of thing. So again, archaeology is equipped to provide certain types of information, but not other kinds of information. And the ideal is to use the information that we have from literary sources, from written sources, together with the archaeological evidence, and try and get as complete a picture of the past as we can.
Okay, that's fantastic that you mentioned that, because there's always this blurry line that we talk about science and archaeology, and you mentioned that it is not quite an exact science in every way. But now, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, that were found so close to the 50s or in the 50s, how do they help us to shape our understanding of the historical Jesus, and in terms of what we read from the New Testament?
Yeah. Right. So if you don't mind, I do want to answer that, but if you don't mind, before that, you actually said something that I would like to address. And you mentioned correctly that archaeology is not an exact science.
Yeah.
And I want to explain, because people again I think the general public out there, and I consider myself a scientist, so people have this, image of archaeology as being scientific and therefore completely objective. The data therefore are unequivocal. Well, that's absolutely not true. But it's important to understand that archaeology, one of the limitations is that archaeology is not an exact science. And the reason it's not an exact science is, first of all, it involves human behavior, which is not exact, but also in the exact sciences, the goal is to conduct an experiment and then replicate the experiment, right? That's the goal. That's how, right? You can't do that in archaeology. You can't replicate the experiment in archaeology, because as soon as you dig that material out of the ground, you have effectively destroyed the data in the process of excavation. Once you've taken that stone out of the ground, you can never put it back the way it was. So archaeology is a destructive process, which is why as archaeologists, we endeavor to record everything we do as completely as possible as we're doing it, because we need to preserve a record of what we have effectively destroyed as we went along. But we don't get a second bite of the apple. We don't get to replicate the experiment. And so that's one of the things that distinguishes archaeology as a discipline from the exact sciences. Now, to your question about the Dead Sea Scrolls. So let me
maybe
just
before you answer that question, if you could sort of highlight what the Dead Sea Scrolls are for the benefit of our audience, because something that we just use these terms so loosely and they don't understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what I was going to do, because I think it's probably fair to say that most people have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I think many do not understand exactly what they are.
Yeah.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls are ancient scrolls, ancient documents that were found in caves near an archaeological site, an ancient site called Qumran, which is on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. As you mentioned in your introduction, the first scrolls were found by accident by Bedouins, by nomads in the winter spring of 1946, 1947, and then additional scrolls were discovered in the years after that. Eventually, the remains, mostly fragmentary remains of approximately 1,000 different scrolls, were found in 11 caves around the site of Qumran, so near the shore of the Dead Sea. These scrolls date mostly to the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, and some of them are a little earlier and some of them are a little later, so they're roughly contemporary with the time of Jesus. And they were deposited in those caves by members of a Jewish sect who lived at the site of Qumran in the 1st century BC and 1st century AD. And that Jewish sect is believed by many scholars, including myself, to be the Essenes, who are a sect mentioned in a number of ancient sources, including the Jewish historian Josephus, who's a very well-known Jewish historian of the 1st century AD. And so many scholars, including myself, identify the community that lived at Qumran and deposited the scrolls in the adjacent caves as Essenes, as this Jewish sect of Essenes. The scrolls comprise different types of literature. Many of the scrolls, in fact, the majority of the scrolls, are either copies of books of the Hebrew Bible, what you would call the Old Testament, right? So copies of books of the Hebrew Bible, or works that are related, Jewish religious works that are related to biblical literature. So interpretations and commentaries on biblical books, translations into Aramaic of biblical books, things like that. But there are also works included among the Dead Sea Scrolls that were written by members of that sect.
Yeah.
And that describe their distinctive worldview and their beliefs and practices. Okay, so what does this have to do with Jesus? When the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, there was a lot of excitement among scholars and the public because it was believed that they would shed light on Jesus and his ministry. Yeah. Actually, and I think that's why probably a lot of people have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because I think in the public mind, the Dead Sea Scrolls are still associated with Jesus. That's why people, think of Dead Sea Scrolls. But in fact, the Dead Sea Scrolls have nothing to do with Jesus at all, at least not directly. Jesus is not mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. None of the people associated with Jesus in the gospel accounts, whether it's John the Baptist or whether James the Just or whatever, later. Anyway, there's no reference in the Dead Sea Scrolls to any of those figures, at least not by those names. There are scholars who claim that you can identify people mentioned by other names in the Dead Sea Scrolls with Jesus or people in a circle. That's not accepted by most scholars. So the scrolls really have nothing directly to do with Jesus. There are no copies of New Testament, no Gospels or anything among the Dead Sea Scrolls. What the Dead Sea Scrolls do is give us information and shed light on the diversity of Judaism in the time of Jesus by first of all, having copies of biblical books and other works related to biblical books that may or may not have been preserved before this, but also by giving us the view of members of a Jewish sect who had some similarities with what we hear about in the gospel accounts with Jesus and his movement, but also some differences. Because one of the things to understand about the time of Jesus, Judaism in the time of Jesus, is that just like today, Jews have always disagreed with each other, and there have always been, many different Jewish groups, and in that period, we sometimes refer to them as sects, but not in the pejorative way that the word sect is used today. So different Jewish groups who all worship the God of Israel as their national God in the temple in Jerusalem, generally, and who believed that, to worship the God of Israel properly, you had to observe the laws in the 5 books of Moses, which are the books that they believed God had given his people. But they disagreed on the exact interpretation of many of those laws. And so what you get is a constellation of different groups who all have overlaps, not necessarily the same overlaps, but in any 2 groups, you'll have some groups, you'll have, certain overlaps, certain things that they agree on, and certain things that they disagree on.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that we get from the Dead Sea Scrolls is information about a group that we didn't really have much information about before, where we can see some really interesting overlaps with what we hear about with Jesus and his movement, which helps us better understand Jesus, even though, again, there's no direct relationship to Jesus, if that makes sense. So I think the biggest example that I would give is that the group at Qumran was an apocalyptic sect that believed the end of days was at hand. And, the world order was about to come to an end. And as a result, there'd be this 40-year-long, battle war between the, forces of good and evil, the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And then you'd have at the end of that, right, with the victory of the sons of light, the establishment of God's kingdom on earth. Well, Jesus's movement was also an apocalyptic movement, right? So even though there are some differences between the two groups, this we can see, and help better understand Jesus's apocalyptic outlook by comparing it with the apocalyptic outlook of the Qumran community. So that's just an example. So it's unfortunately, I'm glad you asked this, because it's unfortunately these sorts of subtleties don't often get conveyed to the public, right? So you have to understand that it's not just like, oh, wow, this is, the Dead Sea Scrolls tell us about Jesus. Well, they don't directly, but they do indirectly. And that's very important, right?
That's so amazing that you say that, of Jodi, because in my understanding is that the Hebrew Bible went through development stages. I mean, the Dead Sea Scrolls kind of give us a snapshot of what the Hebrew Bible would have looked like probably in the 2nd century BC, or throughout the 1st century BC, or even to the 2nd century of the Common Era. So it's just a snapshot of what this sect in Qumran would have, understood the scriptures to be, as you pointed out. But now, do we have anything in the traces that we can sort of pinpoint to a particular individual and say, this is what we have found in the materials in our digging that points to a specific individual when when you do these digs archaeologically?
Well, wait, okay. So again, because your comments are so great, and you raised this issue of what the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament would have looked like, let's say, in the time of Jesus, right? What the Jewish population. So one of the interesting things is, so we have among the Dead Sea Scrolls, approximately 1/4 of the scrolls are copies of books of the Hebrew Bible. Again, mostly fragmentary, not complete.
Yes.
But they're important because they are by far the earliest copies of the Hebrew Bible that have ever been found. So yes, before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the earliest copies that we had of the Hebrew Bible dated to the 9th and 10th centuries AD, like the Middle Ages.
Yes.
So the scrolls, again, are much earlier. And they therefore take us back much closer to the time when the Hebrew Bible was first written down and edited. Yes. And as you said, it then undergoes a very long process of editing and re-editing and revision and rewriting and so on until it reaches us today. And so what people want to know is, well, how does the text of the Hebrew Bible that we have today compare with the text that was, circulating among the Jewish population 2,000 years ago in the time of Jesus? Yes. Were they using the same texts that we're using today, right? And the answer is actually yes and no. Yeah. And the reason is because today we have one standard authoritative version of the Hebrew Bible that all Jews use. And when I say Hebrew Bible, I mean the Bible in Hebrew language, not in translation. Yes. Translations vary, right? So you get whatever, right? Yeah. So in Hebrew, there's one standard authoritative version of the Hebrew Bible that is used today. It's called the Masoretic text, which is sort of the authoritative text. Yes. But it turns out that in the time of Jesus, that is in the time of Qumran, there were different variant texts of the Hebrew Bible that were circulating among the Jewish population. Now, for the most part, the variations aren't huge, but they are variations. So you'll have, a sentence here, a sentence there, or, word here, word there. So there were variant texts that were circulating. And it wasn't until after the time of Qumran and after the time of Jesus that Judaism decided to just take one version and make it standard and authoritative. And at that point, all the other versions ceased to be copied and they disappeared.
Okay.
But one of the important things about the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially from the point of view of scholars who study the Hebrew Bible, is that it gives us an opportunity to understand better the diversity of texts that circulated among the Jewish population in the time of Jesus, right? So that's a very important point that you brought up. And again, it's a point that, it's hard to convey the subtleties of this, right? Because people want to know, well, yes or no, was this, how is it the same Bible that we have today? Well, it is and it isn't, because there are versions of the Proto-Masoretic text among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is, of course, the basis for the Masoretic text that we use today. But then there are also these other variants, right, that we never had before. Yes. So the answer is a yes and a no. Okay, so I'm sorry. So to go back to your
My
other
question,
question.
yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out, because in a sense, we don't have one Bible, if we were to use even that word in particular. We have different traditions of the text itself that are coming from all different strands in Judaism itself. And I know later on that the Masoretic text becomes like the base text for all translations that we have today, in essence.
That's right.
Yeah.
And even today, among different denominations, you have different Bibles. So,
Yeah.
for example, so when you say the Bible, right? So the Protestant Bible is different from the Catholic Bible, right? Some of the order of the books and some of the books that they contain are different. And of course, those are different from the Hebrew Bible. And so, I mean, even just the term the Bible today will connote different things to different people. That's, by the way, one of the problems with, at least in the United States, of course, with this idea that we should teach the Bible in schools, right? Well, then that raises, well, everybody who says that, I'm sure they have in mind their own Bible. But
Yeah.
is it your Bible that we're going to teach in schools, or whose Bible exactly are we going to teach in schools, right? Which one gets the priority? So yeah, right.
Yeah. So my question, before we went into the different strands of the Bible, as you would call it, or as it accepted today, can we pinpoint a particular individual in terms of the traces that you find in archaeological remains to say so and so would have lived here and used this particular material?
Right. Yeah. This is so right. So this is one of these cases where, again, the kind of information that archaeology is not equipped to provide, right? Generally, so I do a lot of work with television documentaries, and they always want to do programs on objects relating to Jesus, whether it's, I don't know, the Shroud of Turin, or the Holy Grail, or stuff like that, right? And the fact is that we don't actually have any identifiable archaeological artifacts that we can associate with Jesus. And there's a very simple reason for that. It's because almost overwhelmingly, I mean, it's almost, I think, 100% true that the archaeological remains that we have that can be identified or associated with a particular individual generally are associated with elites. The super, really super elites, the wealthy people, who were, of course, and usually men, but not only, but mostly men, and that's because they're the ones who had the money to commission or have built or have made artifacts or buildings that leave identifiable remains in the archaeological record. And by identifiable, I mean, usually you have to have an inscription.
Yeah.
Right, or something like that will enable you. So for example, or you have to have a historical source like a Josephus who tells you that somebody built this particular building. So for example, we know that the palaces on top of Masada were built by Herod the Great, King Herod the Great, because Josephus tells us so, right?
Yeah.
We have the tomb of Herod at Herodium, which is where he was buried after he died. We have inscriptions from burials in Jerusalem from the time of Jesus that indicate, the name of the person who was buried inside them. And again, these are people who were wealthy enough to commission, some sort of an elaborate kind of a burial and have an inscription associated with it. So generally speaking, the majority of the population who were not elites, they were not wealthy. By the way, they weren't destitute, but they just weren't wealthy. They were sort of, today they would be kind of lower class or lower middle class, but they weren't destitute. But they typically do not leave identifiable remains in the archaeological record. Now, as I often like to explain, so it's possible that we actually have dug up an artifact that Jesus used. It's possible.
Yeah.
In archaeological excavations, maybe at Capernaum. Capernaum's been extensively excavated by the Franciscans, for example. So there's a big Jewish village, or you could call it a town, at Capernaum from the time of Jesus, with houses and with pottery and so on. maybe Jesus slept in one of those rooms. Maybe Jesus drank out of one of those pottery cups. How would you know unless there was an authentic ancient inscription from the time of Jesus written on that says Jesus drank out of this cup? This is Jesus's cup. You know what I mean? And even then you'd have a problem because Jesus was a common name among the Jewish population.
Yes,
2000
with
years
Jesus. Yes,
ago.
with Jesus you're talking about. Yes.
Either, right. I mean, so you know, we don't have anything like that. People have to understand. So what archaeology can do, and this is, I think, really valuable, is archaeology enables us to understand the world of Jesus and to reconstruct the world of Jesus. So we know what Galilean villages, including Capernaum, looked like in the time of Jesus. We know what the lifestyle of the people was. We know what kind of houses they lived in, what kind of, you know, dishes they ate and drank out of. We know what Jerusalem looked like in the time of Jesus. We know what the temple in Jerusalem, where Jesus, you know, spent his last days. We know all of that. We know what that looked like. And to me, that's extremely valuable in understanding Jesus in his context.
Yeah.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.
I think what you're raising is quite important, because when you're reading either the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible or the Greek text, the New Testament, you don't have the daily lives of these people, especially Jesus and the disciples, and Paul and the other various disciples that we find in the text. We are not told about what they actually did on a day-to-day basis, like eating, bathroom, what did they do? And I know some of the things that interest you is like how they went to the bathroom, which is quite a fascinating topic to actually expound on, because it's something that we take for granted, that these people were normal human beings that had their own particular context, and they did things maybe slightly different to how we do them, but they did them anyway.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's one of the reasons why, even though many people may not necessarily become archaeologists, that I think it's one of the reasons why people find archaeology so fascinating, because it gives you a tangible connection with the human past. And as humans, there are certain things that are universal, that we can all relate to. So we can all relate to sitting down and having a meal, no matter what kind of meal it is or what kind of dishes you're eating off of or whatever. And we can all relate to the fact that, occasionally, yes, you do have to go to the toilet, and so what did they do back then 2,000 years ago? I mean, right, these are basic human things, and they've always been true, right? No matter how things have changed over time.
Yeah, and Jodi, can you sort of expound as to maybe highlighting what are some of the features that these ancient Israelites in the time of Jesus himself would have eaten, in his day?
Yeah,
what was a popular dish at this time? How did they prepare this kind of dish? What utensils did they use? Did they use clay figurines? What did they use? If they were to go to the bathroom, what type of bathroom did they use? How did it all work? In your work, what have you found?
Yeah, well, the food thing is really interesting. So the diet in ancient Palestine overall. So now I'm just not just Galilee, but pretty much the entire country, right? Even until, well, okay. So the diet was a diet that the basic food staple was bread, and the bread could be made from barley or from wheat, depending on if you had the means to afford wheat, which costs more than barley because barley is coarser. That's the basic food item. And the bread generally wasn't baked into a loaf like today, but it was sort of more like pita, something like that, right? Yeah. And your meal then would consist of bread with something that something to dip the bread in, like, and so the best analogy I can give is like today, for example, hummus, is very popular, right? So, mashed up chickpeas. Well, something like that, sort of a bean kind of a spread, or, something like that, with olive oil typically, and you would use the bread to sop up, something that you would smush it into, right? That was your meal. So you didn't actually use utensils. The bread was your utensil, and you would eat out of, so that's like the basic food item. There were also cooked foods. So typically in Palestine, you would cook food in a cooking pot where you would boil stuff. And if you could afford it in a meal, you might put a little bit of meat in there, but meat was expensive. Even chicken was expensive, but you would put, whatever vegetables or beans or whatever, or lentils, and you would stew them in a pot. So you would boil them to death, right? And this had a big advantage, because when you stew something like that, you make it go farther because you're adding liquid. Yeah. And the stewing process also softens what it is that you're cooking. And you have to realize that, a lot of people lost their teeth and had bad teeth over the course of their lifetimes, right? And so chewing was a problem. So you wanted to make things as soft as possible. So you basically got a kind of a soft mush, right? And this then also would be sopped up with bread, right? And it could be served directly out of a cooking pot, or it could be scooped into bowls, right? And people would eat it out of bowls. But that's typically the way that people ate. There was also wine, but again, not at every meal or anything like that. But the wine would have been very different from the wine today. So in antiquity, there was no way to stop the process of fermentation once you extracted the juice from the grapes. So the process of fermentation continued, and that would turn the wine very sour. And therefore, among both the Greeks and the Romans, typically, wine was watered down. You would add water. You would mix your wine with water, and so the idea was actually more like kind of like a lemonade kind of a thing because of the sourness of it. Right. So if we could go back, I think we would not be very impressed by the kinds of that they were eating. The Romans, of course, had a very high cuisine, right? Again, the elites dined differently, right? So the Romans had a very sophisticated culinary culture with all sorts of, elaborate recipes and cookbooks. And they had actually quite a different repertoire of foods that they typically consumed. So the typical diet among the majority of the population in Palestine in Jesus's time would have been quite limited compared to what you would find, let's say, among the elites and especially among the Romans. One of the things that I did find really interesting is in my more recent research is that among the Romans, one of the most beloved types of food were quiches and frittatas. Okay. And this is where you take a shallow pan and you take eggs and you beat them up and you pour them over a mixture. You pour them over things like chopped up vegetables or meat or fish or fruit or something like that. You pour it over with the egg mixture, and then in this shallow pan, and you would either bake this mixture in an oven, or you would cook it over a fire. That's the difference between a quiche and a frittata, right? Whether it's baked in an oven or cooked over on a stove. And this is called a patina or a patella among the Romans. In the time of Jesus in Galilee, those kinds of shallow pans become ubiquitous among the Jewish population. And they remain ubiquitous for centuries afterwards. And in fact, Jewish rabbinic literature in the centuries after the time of Jesus refers to cooking this kind of egg preparation. So it turns out that eggs were apparently very popular in Galilee, and that the Jews in Galilee adopted this kind of recipe from the Romans, apparently, and it becomes very popular. It's a very easy kind of a thing to do, and it's very nutritious, of course, right? And if you have chickens, you're raising chickens, you're always going to have eggs. Yeah. So that's one of the things where you see actually a little bit of Roman influence on the Jewish diet in Galilee, at least. Interestingly, Judea with Jerusalem is another case, but it's also more complicated. But we do see that in Galilee. So that's the diet part of it. And by the way, people typically did not sit at a table to dine, not in ancient Palestine, right? They would have squatted or sat on the ground or something like that, right? That was not the sitting at a table. You might sit at a table to dine if you were at a real proper banquet and had a banquet hall where you had, these couches, dining couches like that the Romans would use. But in a typical, sort of village or town context, among most people in ancient Palestine, you would not have reclined to dine, you would not have sat to dine, you would have either squatted or sat on the floor. So the toilet habits are interesting. So the toilets and toilet habits varied depending on where you were and what you had access to.
Okay.
So the Romans, again, there's this great scene in Monty Python's Life of Brian, What Did the Romans Ever Do for Us? So the Romans invented the most sophisticated kind of toilet facility in the ancient world. And I think that this probably was not outdone until, modern plumbing in the 20th century. So this kind of Roman sophisticated toilet facility is called a Roman luxury latrine. And it consists of a room usually attached to a bathhouse. And in Roman bathhouses, you would have a constant stream of water brought in by aqueduct. So fresh water brought in by aqueduct. The water would circulate around the rooms in the bathhouse and then finally to the latrine room, where it would be carried in a channel underground along the sides of the room. And over the channel, you would have a row of stone or wooden seats. And the waste would then go down into the water in the channel and it would be carried away from the bathhouse. So this is very sophisticated. Now, the thing is that type of facility is only where you have, an aqueduct bringing in a constant supply of fresh water. And it doesn't even really appear in Palestine before the 2nd century. And even then it never becomes super common. So you have those, but they're very rare and most people wouldn't have had access to them. And certainly not in the time of Jesus. So what were the other options? So if you were in a house, there were houses that had indoor toilet facilities, and they looked sort of like what an outhouse would look like today. So basically you would have a cesspit dug into the floor of the room and a stone or a wooden seat set over the cesspit. And then when the cesspit became filled, a manure merchant would be called to clear out the cesspit, and the manure merchant would sell the contents of the cesspit to be used as fertilizer for the agricultural field. Nice. Yeah, wow. That's right. Still, by the way, done in some parts of the world today.
Yeah.
And this is, by the way, why, those of us who come from, places like the US, if we travel to some other parts of the world, we have to be very careful about getting sick because, we lack the immunity to diseases and, we haven't been exposed to things like this. So there are houses that have those types of built toilet facilities. They're not super common again, but we do have them. You can actually see toilet facilities like that at Pompeii. A lot of the houses at Pompeii have a toilet like that with a wooden seat over a cesspit in a room in a house. And usually that toilet room is next to the kitchen, believe it or not.
Wow.
And the reason is because the cesspit was also used for the disposal of kitchen waste.
All right.
Yeah. Now, so what if you're in what if you're in a house though that doesn't have a built toilet like that, a cesspit, right, like an outhouse type of a thing, which wasn't outdoors, it was in the house. But anyway, what if you're in a house like that, no toilet facility? What do? You basically use, the analogy would be I'm blanking on the term. A chamber pot. Okay. So, right. So like basically you would take something like a chamber pot in the ancient world that might have been like the lower part of a jar or something like that. And you would use that inside the house. And then what would you do with the contents? Where would you empty the contents? You would toss the contents out onto the street below.
I know.
So if you're walking through, right. So if you're walking through the alleys or streets of, a town or a village, the contents of, the chamber pots will be emptied into those areas. And in fact, if you think of a city like Pompeii, where you have these very high curbs of sidewalks along the sides of the streets and then stepping stones across the street. Well, the reason is because the waste was tossed out onto the street. So the curbs and the high sidewalks protect you. And in a place like Pompeii, water would be carried into fountains, fountains along the street, and the overflow from the fountains would wash the waste away. So this is why, Pompeii is an example of a relatively advanced city. But again, if we're talking about Palestine in the time of Jesus, that's not what you have. You have, basically what you have in most other ancient cities where, the waste gets disposed of in the streets. And then what happens if you're if you're not in a house, but you're just outdoors somewhere, right? And you're in the city, you're in the town, or wherever, and you have to go. What do? Right? And you don't have access to a toilet facility, you just go anywhere. And people did. I mean, people would just find places to go. I found examples of shops at Pompeii where the shopkeeper wrote on the outside of the shop, "Don't go here." There's actually a lot of Roman legislation prohibiting people from going in public places like the insides of mausolea or whatever certain corners of public buildings or whatever. So people actually literally would just go anywhere they could. And by the way, again, this is something that you do still see in some parts of the world today, even today.
Wow, that's fascinating. I think we've just discussed it, our audience, of telling them about toilets, but I think it's something we cannot avoid because it's a human nature to go to the bathroom. So it's something that we all do. Yeah.
Exactly. And I like to say that if we could be retrojected back 2,000 years in time, first we would be bowled over by the odorama. I mean, we would just, right? But the other thing is we would all be dead in a week because we lack the immunity to the diseases, and connected with that, by the way, is the fact that you have to realize that in a place like Palestine, whether we're in Judea, we're in Galilee or whatever, that there's very little, fresh water. I mean, right? It rains for a few months during the year. The rest of the year, it doesn't rain. So your water sources in towns and villages, the water sources that tend to be used, including for drinking water, is water that's stored in pools and cisterns over the course of the year. And that water spread disease if you, right? So if you survive to adulthood, you had developed an immunity to most of those diseases, although of course adults could also get sick and die. But to us, if we were retrojected back into that world, we don't be sick and dead within a week, because we don't have the immunity to those diseases.
Wow, that's so true. And Jodi, what you mentioned is quite profound, because archaeology helps us to pinpoint how Jesus would have lived his life, but it doesn't actually give us the exact artifacts that he would have used, like pottery jars, right, and a dish that he would have used, or a cup, or even a mug that he would have used. But now, looking at that, how does then, you find today people in the modern world, in the church, they would say this is the tomb that Jesus would have sort of slept in, or maybe resurrected from, as he would have supposedly gone up to heaven. What is your take on that from an archaeological perspective?
Right. So, well, that's a whole nother story. So, of course, there is a site in Jerusalem, a church in Jerusalem, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is so called because, according to tradition, it enshrines both the spot where Jesus is believed to have been crucified, right, the hill of Golgotha or Calvary, as well as the tomb in which his body was laid when he died, when he was taken out from the cross. Now, the thing about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is that it was built by Constantine in the 4th century AD, about 300 years after the death of Jesus. And it is therefore one of the earliest churches that was ever built, because before Constantine legalized Christianity for the first time in the Roman Empire. So before the time of Constantine, Christians could not worship openly without fear of persecution, and therefore we don't have any churches before the time of Constantine.
Yeah.
So the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is one of the very earliest churches that we have. And that means that the tradition that this is the spot where Jesus was crucified and buried goes back to at least to the time of Constantine, which is 300 years after the death and burial of Jesus.
Right.
So because of that, many scholars believe that this tradition is authentic, right? That the Christian community in Jerusalem preserved the authentic memory of the spot where Jesus had been crucified and buried up until the point when Constantine builds the church there, because it is such an early tradition, right? But there is still a 300-year gap there. Yeah. I mean, 300 years is a lot of time, actually.
Yes, long time,
Maybe if we're looking back today, 300 years isn't so long, but 300 years is a long time, right? Time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is actually no way, we don't have any way to prove that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in fact the authentic spot where Jesus was crucified and buried. There's no way to prove that. The best that we can say is that since at least 300 years after the time of Jesus, it has been believed to be the spot. That's about as close as you can get. Now, there is one more thing. When Constantine built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there apparently was a Jewish cemetery from the time of Jesus on that spot. And to build the church, Constantine cut back the rock of the cemetery because the tombs were rock-cut tombs. So he cut back the rock to leave the shrine, to isolate and leave the tomb of Jesus, which he then enshrined within the circular dome structure called the rotunda. We actually have remains of some of those rock-cut tombs that were not cut back by Constantine because they lay outside the area of the church, what comes to be the church. So we do have archaeological proof that there was a Jewish cemetery that dates to the 1st century, the time of Jesus, on that spot. And that's actually pretty valuable because one of the things about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for it to be authentic, it has to have been located outside the wall of the city at the time of Jesus, because according to the gospel accounts, Jesus was taken outside the walls of the city to be crucified and buried. And Jews in Jerusalem typically buried their dead outside the walls of the city. So if there was a Jewish cemetery there, then it apparently indicates that that spot was outside the walls of the city at that time. So that's actually pretty interesting. But what archaeology cannot prove is that Jesus was laid to rest in one of those tombs. Oh, yeah. Right. So the closest, the closest we can come then is to say, yes, this was a Jewish cemetery, apparently in the time of Jesus, right? And that 300 years later, right, certainly it was venerated as the spot where Jesus was crucified and buried. But can archaeology prove that Jesus was actually laid to rest in one of those rock-cut tombs?
Can't prove. Yeah.
Right.
I think, Jodi, we are running out of time, but as a last comment from you, what would you say is best for some of our audience to sort of look out for when they look for? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that is written on the internet these days. What are the tips that you can give them to look out for, so for authentic kind of information that one has to be careful for when they're looking out at archaeological discovery, and also if there are archaeological digs that you guys are doing, if one wants to participate in that, how does one get involved? Because I know it's a lot of work as well to be part of this digging sites. Yes. So yeah, what do you say about that? Yeah.
Yeah, the internet thing is a really good question and a hard question because, you know, unfortunately, it's the most sensational claims that tend to get publicized.
Yeah.
And so not all sensational claims are by necessarily, you know, by definition untrue, but even if they're not untrue, sometimes they are sensational. So they, you know, present things in a way that's not completely accurate. And so I don't know if I have, I think it's just like everything else on the internet. You have to be very careful about what your sources of information are, right? You have to be critical and evaluate critically where your information is coming from. And it's just like everything else on the internet. I mean, here I am, I'm sure you're dealing with it too, right? A lot of misinformation about vaccination, right, on the internet. So you have to, right? So you have to be careful and critical of where your information is coming from, right? Look at the sources.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. That's in a nutshell. The second thing about digging. So, you know, I run my dig as a field school for students for academic credit. So if you have students out there, by the way, who are interested in joining us, go to the HUCOC website and I urge them to go and contact us. We'd love to have you join us. generally try to discourage people who are not students, from joining, because I did try to, run it as a field school. But there are lots of dig opportunities for people out there. And I think the best advertising is actually, there's a magazine called Biblical Archaeology Review.
Yeah.
Biblical Archaeology Review. The website is bib-arc.org. And they, in their January issue, they always advertise dig opportunities in general in Israel and Jordan. So I would, encourage everybody to look at the January issue of BAR, Biblical Archaeology Review. And there are other sources. The Israel Antiquities Authority also sometimes advertises digs. The Archaeological Institute of America also, which is archaeological.org. They advertise dig opportunities, not necessarily just in the Holy Land, right, but in other places as well. So you can there's lots of ways to get involved in a dig.
All right.
And it is hard work. It is hard work.
I know that's very hard.
It's hard physical labor. You're picking, you're shoveling, you're hoeing. It's hot, dirty. Yeah, it's not glamorous. It's hard, and you don't get to keep what you find. Yeah.
I know, and they may run into some ancient toilets in the process. Yeah. Yeah. Jodi, it has been good having you on the platform, and I certainly hope our audience have benefited a lot from this conversation. And before I let you go, is there anything in particular that you are working on in the pipeline in terms of your digs, or that you are trying to publish this year or early next year, or something that you'd like our audience to get their hands on in terms of what you have?
Oh, I don't know. All of our publications for the dig are posted on the dig website. We do have something coming out that's going to be a scholarly article, hopefully before December, on more of our mosaics that aren't yet published. So you keep your eyes out that once it's out, we'll post it. And as I mentioned, I'm in the midst of working on this book on Jerusalem, which is going to be a trade book. So for, a non-specialist audience, but it's such a huge project. I have a contract. I'm supposed to deliver it to the publisher next September. So in a year. But that's going to be, but that'll be at least a couple more years at the earliest before that appears in print, right? So those are the big projects for now.
Fantastic. Jodi, it's certainly been great having you on the show, and I certainly hope all our viewers have enjoyed this conversation on the Jesus of archaeology, shedding some light on what Jesus would have done on a day-to-day basis. So we thank you for that, and until next time, your viewers must just keep tuning in to these fascinating conversations. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Puluso Ministries is a non-profit educational enterprise founded in 2019. The ministry is informed by academic scholarship. At Puluso, we embrace multiple perspectives in our engagement with Scripture. We seek to provide non-Christians and Christians from all backgrounds and denominations with resources that provide an honest intellectual engagement with the Bible. We embrace multiple perspectives in fostering a more open, moderate society into the 21st century and beyond.
To ensure that we keep bringing you tough conversations like these, please support our ministry by donating as little as 50 Rand per month. You can find our banking details on our website, pulusoministries.co.za.